Hello and welcome back to Fosseway Classic Car Workshop. In the previous episode I got most of the way of getting this engine ready to remove prior to taking it to Classic Engine Workshop in Worcestershire for restoration. In anticipation of that restoration I visited Roger as he's restored lots of XK engines already, including one recently finished which is a 4.2 litre Series 1 E-Type engine, very much like this one. It'll allow me to look at what this one's going to look like once it's finished, but also gives us an opportunity to discuss the engine as a whole, what it's made from, how it's put together, and an insight into the engineering decisions that were made that make it such a great engine in the first place. I'm back here at Classic Engine Workshop with Roger, and today we're going to be talking about the XK6 or XK 6-cylinder engine. Please take us through the kind of main physical elements of the engine and how it's laid out.
It's a lovely twin cam design. Over here you've got the twin overhead cams, an aluminium cylinder head, aluminium intake manifold and coolant rail, and you've got a set of SU carburetors on here, triple 2-inch SU carburetors, HD8s. You've got a cast iron cylinder block under here, and this big cast aluminium sump at the bottom. This is the oil filter housing, so the oil is drawn up by the oil pump into this, filtered and then fed into the main gallery and into the crankshaft from there. You've got a distributor here which is driven off the oil pump drive as well, so they're shared between those two.
So now looking at the front of the engine, so take us through what we see here.
Okay, so there's three things of note that are probably worth talking about on the front of the engine. The first is the tensioner, the adjuster for the top chain. This is a really useful technique to be able to get to this and tighten it up a little bit. If you've got a rattly chain, you can give it a bit of extra life by getting in here and tightening it up. It's very simple to do. Just loosen this nut in the middle, turn it anti-clockwise a notch or two by pressing this button in and using a special tool to rotate it. Release the button, nip the nut back up, and you're done. You don't want to be making these chains very tight. They just need to take any of the slack out. Extra tension will eventually cause damage to the components. Then coming down here, this is where the water pump goes on, and the impeller sits in here and is driven from the crankshaft. So if we move down to the crankshaft, this is a crankshaft damper which takes out harmonic frequencies which can be damaging to the crank. Ideal upgrade to this, not on this particular engine, but one that I would heartily recommend, is to obtain yourself a fluid damper which essentially has a viscous ring in here which takes out harmonic frequencies from the crankshaft, a much wider range of harmonic frequencies than a single rubber ring will do.
So is there a belt that goes off that crank pulley?
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got a belt which comes off this and drives the alternator, which sits up here, and also there's an additional pulley which bolts onto these 4 bolt holes here, which drives the water pump and a fan if you have one as well. It's all built around this massive cast iron block down here, which houses the crankshaft, which is a long stroke crank. It's a big heavy thing, and these long rods and tall pistons. So I've got some rods here. You can see that it's quite a long con rod. That really helps with the architecture of the engine in terms of keeping piston speeds down. And the engine turns relatively low RPM, so it's not a high revving engine. Mm-hmm. It's a strong, torquey engine. It's got a long stroke. You get that great leverage from the long stroke of the crankshaft. You've got the long rods which give rise to lower piston speeds, and because of that you've got this very tall, strong, sturdy cast iron block, and even 50 and 60 years after these engines have been produced, these castings are in great shape and they can be reconditioned very well.
Okay. So it tends to last quite well, so it's known for being reliable and durable.
It's a reliable, durable thing. I mean, there are certain problems. They do have the main bore where the crankshaft goes through can go out of alignment if it's had any overheating in the past. That's one of the things that can happen. And the other thing is particularly the 4.2s crack between the bores because the bores are quite close together.
Right.
But those are problems that can be managed through machining after strip down. Mm-hmm. So we'll, for instance, we'll inspect the line and line hone or line bore it to get it true again if that needs to be done. And with the bores, we take out the original liners, bore them out, have it acid dipped to clean out any sludge and scale that's built up over the decades, and then have new liners put in. And of course, if there's any cracking between the bores, that's fine, because the new liners almost touch each other in that region, and therefore those cracks are essentially machined away and replaced. So there's absolutely no problem with restoring the block. And it's that big, long, tall block that gives this kind of elegant height on it. And because it's a long stroke crank, the crank dips quite low into the sump as well. So it's a big hefty crankshaft that spins around this central axis. And of course, cast aluminium sump is great for stiffness, overall stiffness of it, and also the quality of the sealing between the block and the sump. Yeah. So you're not getting leaks.
So they generally don't leak between. I mean, we were discussing before about a pressed steel sump pan where they can go wavy over time, whereas this looks pretty robust.
It's a very robust bit of kit. I think this sump unique to the E-Type for the XK engine, and also they have a rope seal. Oil seal at the rear main, which
those are prone to leaking.
They are prone to leaking, and this engine has in fact got an upgrade on it, which is a lip seal conversion, which is quite involved and fairly expensive. You're looking at about £1,000, something like that, to have the conversion done. Because it comes with a new flywheel, because the rear end of the crank is machined to accept the lip seal, and actually the original mounting bolts for the flywheel are machined away, and new bolts installed in their place. So it is a bit of involved engineering to make that happen, but it's a great upgrade for reliability and peace of mind. It stops it from dripping
on your garage floor.
And
or preserving your underbody.
Exactly. Well, yeah, exactly. Not a bad thing in the good old days. There's a few engine leaks have preserved bodywork over the years. So that's the heart of the thing.
So if we talk about the bottom end of the engine, I see we've got a couple of XK conrods here. Both look quite different. Can you take us through? I assume this older looking one is a standard.
For sure, this is a standard forged rod that you'd find in the engine to start with. It's a fairly conventional I-beam rod. It's a reasonable design for its era. They're quite heavy, particularly in the big end, and they are prone to failure as well. These old rods.
Where would they fail?
Well, they can fail in the shaft itself, and particularly if the bolts aren't replaced at rebuild, they can also fail in the big end here. So it's always important when you rebuild one of these engines to replace, at the very least, the rod bolts, because they're the most stressed component in the whole engine, and they do have a fatigue life, and if they've been bolted and unbolted a number of times as well, it's ideal to replace those. This is the original rod. The other thing about these is when you recondition them, you need to look at the little end bush and whether there's any wear in that. Quite often they're okay, actually, the little ends, they're fairly robust. There's not a lot of clearance in them, so they don't wear too badly. And the big ends, they can stretch and oval over time, and that's something that can be corrected through machining. So what you do is you remove the cap and you machine this, both faces of the rod. You put it back together again, bolt it up, and then you hone the big end into shape again, and that can correct any out of round condition. But that's an expense that you might want to consider an alternative, which would be, for instance, going for a more modern rod. These are quite an affordable alternative. This is kind of like a fast road rod, if you like. It's not a full.
It's an entirely different kind of section. The shape across here is very different.
Yeah, that's right. So this is a conventional I-beam rod. This is called an H-beam, and it's a lighter design. You've got less bulk, particularly in these areas, but it's still as strong as the original rod. And this one's quite nicely finished as well. It looks like it's been shot peened or something like that to increase the fatigue life of the rod. So it's quite nicely finished. And something like this, a set like this is about £800, something like that. So it's well worth considering it when you'd probably be spending something like half of that reconditioning a set of original rods.
So Roger, I've noticed these notches in the big end here that are cut away in both of them. What are those for?
So those are locators for the bearing shells. So when you look at a bearing shell, I've got one here, you've got these little tangs sticking out, which ensure that you align and insert the bearings the right way round. Sometimes you've got oil holes which are offset, for instance, and you want to make sure that they always line up with the oil feed gallery to the bearing. And if these weren't in place, then you wouldn't effectively be able to put them in position. One of the things people mistake these for is for securing the bearings the bearing shells into the housing. That's not what they do. They locate it for initial installation. Once you've tightened up the bolts and sandwiched the two halves of the bearing in place, that's what retains the bearing and prevents it from rotating. It's actually clamped in. And then from that point onwards, you get a thing called crush, which is when the two halves are bolted together, they sandwich together, and it actually forces this back of the bearing into the housing. And that's very, very important because of heat transfer from the oil. So as the oil's going through here, a lot of the heat is being transferred through into the rod or into the block to get that heat out of it. So that's also very important.
Oh, very good. And so you were saying earlier that these are obviously quite long rods. I picked one off the shelf here that's by comparison very small.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, I think this is a really interesting comparison if we look at the two together. So these are both an equivalent engine. These are both a 3.8 litre engine, roughly. This is a Porsche 911. This happens to be a GT3 Cup engine, which is why this is a titanium conrod. But if you just look at the geometry of it and the length of it, you can see that you've got a similar sort of size going on here and at the little end as well. So the forces are quite equivalent. But in this case, you've got a high revving engine, and in this case, you've got a low revving long stroke engine. So this is just a different way of delivering torque and power. So this is all about the power. This is a high revving power engine, 8,000 RPM. This is a lower revving torquey engine, long stroke, long rod, and it's an interesting comparison to see the two side by side.
So while we're on the bottom end, you're talking earlier about the sealing at the end of the crank, and you've pulled this off a shelf. So take us through what all this is.
Yeah, okay. So this is part of the modification that we make to install a modern lip seal. So this is the lip seal, this brown thing in here. It's made of a material called Viton, which is very tough, heat resistant. It can run quite dry without the oil, which other seals can't. They break up. So for instance, a butyl seal or a rubber seal will break up. These are very resistant. So it's a good quality seal. And this is the original rope seal housing. So this is what a rope seal looks like. It's two halves like this, and they're pressed into this housing.
It literally is.
Yeah.
Zoom right in. It
It is
rope.
It is. It's a piece of rope, and you can bend it around. They're quite flexible, and you're relying on a lot of luck to make sure that they're sealing properly, and there's all sorts of tricks you can play to make them work. But this is ultimate because what you're doing is you're doing away with that split line altogether. So you're taking the element of chance out of it. But as I mentioned earlier, they also require a crankshaft modification and a new flywheel to install this. So it's a bit of an investment, but it's certainly one that gives you additional reliability and peace of mind for a car, especially a car that's only used occasionally as well, because these rope seals do tend to dry out if they're not used regularly, and they shrink a little bit, and then you get the gaps and it starts to leak out. Whereas these are a robust, fit and forget, 20-year lifespan kind of item.
Okay, so if we focus on the cylinder head specifically, I can see that so it's a twin overhead cam.
Yeah, that's right.
And we've got a chain drive.
Yeah,
from the crank here.
That's right. You've got a lower chain that drives up to an idler, which sits in at the front here, and then that drives the top chain, which drives the two camshafts and is adjusted.
I assume it's like a duplex chain for safety reasons.
Yeah, just for strength and longevity. It was the done thing. I think it was always considered to be more robust than a single chain. Although there have been instances where I've seen single chains used in quite high performance engines. So I think a single chain is capable, but I think a duplex has probably got a longer service life. Yes. And you've got camshafts. Lovely simple design. You've got camshafts acting directly on a follower, a tappet, that acts directly on top of the valve, and they're adjusted with a shim.
Right.
There's a number of different.
So clearance is adjusted with a shim too.
Yeah, that's right. So underneath the bucket is a shim about the size of a 2p piece.
Right.
And you adjust that by taking that out and replacing it with one of a different thickness until you've got the clearance that you need. And the earlier engines had a smaller clearance in there to keep the noise down, and the later ones they just redesigned the cam profile with a slightly smoother ramp off the base circle and onto the lobe that lifts and sets the valve down a little more gently than the earlier ones. and you get a bigger clearance here, which allows a bit more reliability.
A different way.
Yeah. So they just went, yeah, exactly. So
I can see in here there's this. I don't think that's standard. So can you tell us what's going on there?
Yeah. So those are the tappet guide tie downs that we use to stop the tappet guides coming out of place. They can dislocate under heavy use. Right. So if you revving the engine, driving it hard on the road, racing it, then that's a good little modification to put in place, because when one comes loose, this will stop it from doing any damage. It won't stop it from coming loose, but it will stop it from doing damage.
Yeah.
Whereas if it comes loose and we haven't got one of these things in place, then you've got high likelihood that it's going to do some catastrophic stuff when the follower will cockle in the bore and seize. And then you've got all sorts of problems.
Yeah, bank camshafts.
Yeah, exactly.
And whatever goes
goes wrong behind that. Yeah, exactly. So that can make a real mess when they come loose. So I think it's just a nice thing to do for peace of mind if you're intending to use the engine quite hard. Yes. It's not common.
Okay, one thing about this, I mean, I've read that there's there was an aircraft influence in the design. Sir William Lyons wanted the engine to look good. So I think we've got here one of the cast up the camshaft covers that goes on here. So okay, so offer this.
Yeah,
one.
Of course it is. Yeah, absolutely.
So if we look at that when it's in place, that's very much the the classic view of an XK engine.
Yeah, it's a handsome thing, isn't it?
It really is.
It's got a real aircraft quality to it, and in fact they numbered the cylinders from back to front as you would in an aircraft engine, with the prop coming directly out of the rear end of the engine. So and it's unconventional, and it's a little bit of, I think it's just a little bit of a sort of Jaguar conceit to say, oh well, it's like an aircraft engine, and they've got that look perfectly. I think it's a beautiful thing. It's a handsome, elegant thing. You want to lift the bonnet and have a look at this kind of engine, and it's got these big cam covers and everything. Just brings to mind the heady days of the warbirds of the World War II, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's a lovely thing.
Okay, so if we look at the cylinder head, my observations with this is, firstly, it's a big chunk of aluminium.
For sure.
Secondly, those look very much like hemispherical combustion chambers. So, from my minimal knowledge of American V8s, the Hemi is a very well-known engine.
Yes.
But this is a Hemi straight six.
It is. It's a Hemi design. The American Hemi engines were expensive to produce, and that's why they went to the more conventional single rocker shaft type of engines that they moved to. If you look at a Hemi, a Chrysler Hemi, which is the one you're talking about, they've got two rocker shafts, and they're taking advantage of the way that the valves are canted and lean into the combustion chamber and give you this flow through. So this design was kind of state of the art for two valve engines at the time, and was really reserved for premium stuff. You see this in, for instance, Alfa Romeos, Lancias, those kind of engines. Ferraris of the period have exactly this kind of combustion chamber as well, and of course the XK. And the lovely thing about it, of course, is you've got two big valves. There's lots of space.
Those are big valves.
They're big valves. You've got lots of space, and you can actually go bigger in these chambers than standard as well. There is room to go considerably bigger on these valves. So it's an ideal shape. It was almost as close to a sort of pent roof as you can get, whilst maintaining this surface area of combustion chamber. So it's a really nice design. Straight through, of course, cross flow head, so ideal for gas flow. The gas doesn't want to have to come in, do a U-turn and go back out a port on the same side of the head, which you would see in lesser engines than this of the period. The other thing about this, because it's a low compression ratio, you can see this is a typical XK piston. This is an 8-to-1 piston. It's got a very small dome on it, which increases that compression ratio. A 9-to-1 piston has a slightly larger dome, but even that is not a huge dome as well. So when it's right up at the top of its stroke, you've still got quite an open combustion chamber design, which is really quite good for combustion. So it's a nice design overall. Okay, so this is a 4.2 cylinder head that we've restored. It's been stripped down to its bare bones, vapor blasted. It's had bronze valve guides installed, which are can run tighter clearances and have a much longer life as well than the cast iron originals. And it's been skimmed as well to give it a clean gasket face.
Many thanks to Roger at Classic Engine Workshop for taking me through all of that. I think it's really interesting and I'm really looking forward to seeing this engine once it's restored. I'd better get it out now so that I can get it to him and we can start that restoration process. Thanks for watching.